Jim, Sam Harris questioned, how do we know that our holy books are free from error? Because the books themselves say so. In considering the accuracy of the Gospels, how important is the relationship between time and reliability?
Yeah, I think if as an atheist, I was 35, I was a non-believer. And as an atheist, I think if you just said, well, I trust that this is accurate because they say they're accurate, that would not have been sufficient for me. I had to come at it a different way. And I think that's fair for us as Christians, although we trust the Scriptures, to be able to make the case for non-believers who still have doubts. And so I think there's a relationship between how early is the document written to how reliable it is as an eyewitness account. This is one of the 4 characteristics of eyewitness testimony that we try to examine in every criminal trial. When an eyewitness testifies, we can ask ourselves 4 categories of questions. And one of those categories is simply, was this person really there when they say they were there? And believe it or not, there are some witnesses who want to testify to things that they didn't even see because of the fame of the moment, their interest in the case, the celebrity it might bring to them. So we have to ask that question of the gospel writers. Were they actually written? Were the Gospels written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses? This alone does not mean they're true. This alone does not mean that the witnesses aren't lying. But we have to ask that question, how early were they written? And I think there's a good circumstantial case that can be made. Again, I don't want to say that, remember, circumstantial evidence is very powerful in a courtroom. This is not to be denigrated, oh, it's just circumstantial. No, every case I've worked as a cold case detective has been entirely circumstantial. And we can make good cases that are clear for jurors. Now, let me give you a quick, brief circumstantial case for early dating. You'll notice that in no New Testament account is there any mention of the destruction of the temple. It's missing from every New Testament document, even though in Matthew 23, Jesus predicts the destruction. Wouldn't it be great to mention its fulfillment? It's missing. The siege of Jerusalem is also missing 2 or 3 years prior to the destruction of the temple. 1 Peter would have been a great place to mention the suffering that Christians endured during this time of the siege, but none of it's mentioned anywhere. As a matter of fact, the 3 most important characters in the book of Acts, James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, and Paul, are all alive at the end of the book of Acts. Paul's in custody. There's no mention of Peter's death, no mention of James. Now, remember, the writer Luke is going to write about the death of Stephen, the death of James, the brother of John. Why omit the deaths of all the 3 primary players? And we know James, for example, history puts his death right around 61 AD. Well, I think that all of these things are missing because of the fact that they hadn't happened yet. That's the one explanation that would account for all the absences of those 5 elements. And so it's a good inference from the evidence. But in addition to that, I think there are a couple of places in 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians where Paul seems to either be referencing directly Scripture from Luke or concepts that Luke is also talking about in his Scripture. There's good reason to believe, I think, that Paul is familiar with Luke's writings. And remember, the book of Acts, if we did it before 61, the death of James, we've got to put the gospel right in front of that because he says he writes the gospel first. And we've got Paul referencing the gospel as early as 53 to 57 in 1 Corinthians. How early is this now? Because remember, Luke is going to reference more than anyone else the gospel of Mark. He says he's interviewing eyewitnesses. And he says he's going to make an orderly account for Theophilus. Why would he say an orderly account? Well, Papias said that Mark's account, although accurate, was not orderly. It almost appears that Luke is referencing Mark, and so I think it's reasonable. The reasonable inference is to place Mark in front of Luke. And as I kind of work through the circumstantial case, I think we've got accounts that begin to appear in the late 40s, early 50s, and that means they're appearing early enough in history to have been written by eyewitnesses. That alone is not going to say that they're reliable yet. It's just one aspect of reliability.